So it's a small number of actors that have made very effective demands on the Australian political system over the last 2 to 3 decades. So we've had, Prime Minister after Prime Minister lose their jobs over, effective campaigns run by coal, oil and gas interests in this company. So I would say the political class, in particular, the Australian Labor Party, is absolutely terrified of the fossil fuels industry. The fossil fuels industry has spent enormous amounts of time developing relationships and enormous amounts of resource in maintaining those relationships and making very, very effective and delivering on political threats. So, I think that explains the disconnect between the will of the people and the will of politicians in this country.
Okay, so let's get started then. First of all, thanks for joining us, Brynn O'Brien, on our Climate 360 podcast. I wonder if we could start with, before we get into the work of the Australasian Centre of Corporate Responsibility, just a quick introduction to yourself. Where did you come from? What's your background? How did you get to where you are today?
Yeah, sure. It's great to be with you. I've been in this role, executive director of ACCR, for coming up on 9 years early next year, which is the longest I've ever been in a role for. My background is as a lawyer, first of all in corporate and commercial law at a law firm, and then in the space of international law, particularly looking at business and human rights, a bit of migration, but I've always just been really interested in power, and in particular corporate power and the effect it has on people's lives. And over the years, got more interested in the role of investors as representatives of the retirement interests of regular people. So, in particular, super fund and pension fund investors, and the responsibility they have to ensure that regular people have wealth in retirement, have enough to live off, but also increasingly that they understand their responsibilities for the kinds of societies and futures that we retire into. And that, I think, has led me into being very activated on climate change.
How do you feel that the current corporate environment take on climate is? Is it if you were giving it a score out of 10 as a schoolmaster, what would you be giving it? Is it a 5 or a 7 or a 2?
Oh, look, I think if we were still dealing with kind of 2015 facts, maybe I'd be giving it a 5 or a 7, but we're dealing with 2025 facts, and the reality of our physical situation has become much worse and much clearer. And so I'd give it a 1, 2, like we're barely out of the starting blocks. So I think while there is much more regulatory infrastructure around reporting and disclosure are not adequate to the task that we now face, which is really rapid mitigation of physical risk, which means reducing real world emissions. So do we have corporate or regulatory regimes that do that? Certainly not in this country just yet. And I've just come back from a year and a half living in Europe, and while their European systems are probably a bit more advanced, really not adequate to the task of real world emissions reductions as yet. But there's certainly a lot we can do. We're just choosing not to do those things.
It's really interesting you say you answer that question by comparing a 2015 to 2025, because you absolutely hit the nail on the head there, that the knowledge environment, the information environment changes every day and every week and every year, and certainly it would seem that the kind of thinking that was around when the Paris Agreement was signed, and all the sense of hitting one, keeping to 1.5 and no more than two, seemed very doable. It surprises me that, in fact, um, the conversation has not moved more substantively to reflect the fact that those numbers are now, most people who know what they're talking about consider those numbers to be well gone. And we're somewhere between 2.5 and 3, whether it's the Australian Academy of Science or the United Nations or wherever you look to, those numbers seem to be quite ratcheted up. But in the general conversation, if you're listening to the news on the TV, people are still commonly referring to 1.5 as if that hasn't much changed. Would you say that in the corporate world that also there's a slow willingness to acknowledge that substantial change?
Look, I think there are competing incentives in relation to global temperature goals. So I'm not surprised that kind of with where we are, because of my area of work is corporate power, and I know how hard the fossil fuels industry has fought to delay action, and to keep us locked into these uh, you know old ways of thinking. So, I think that the current policies, projections, and so on are taking us towards that sort of 2.5+ degrees mark. But that's totally unacceptable, right? That
Mm.
the level of misery that we will face at 2.5 to 3 degrees is an unacceptable, an intolerable level of misery. So what we need to now be focused on, like, yes, the science is conclusive. 1.5 is out of reach based on current technology and trajectories. But the reason we're in this situation is political decision making. Like, we have had the technology, we've had the opportunity for the last 10 years to get to 1.5, to hold global temperature increase to 1.5. We just haven't made those choices. So I think we still have the opportunity to prevent 2.5 degrees, to prevent these catastrophic warming scenarios. We think we do. Like, the best science suggests that we still have an opportunity, that there's still a lot to play for. So we really need to get focused on those political and corporate decisions that avoid misery.
Yeah. What's interesting, of course, is that uh, in some cases, commercial interests are and corporate interests are aligned with, let's say, shareholder values, or you would think that that would be the kind of fiduciary requirements, that there would be some connection between the values of those who are shareholders and the values essentially expressed through the company. Um, and we know that with the last election, there was very high percent, a lot of polling, a lot of people saying 70, 75%, 76% of Australians significantly concerned about climate change, want to see stronger action, etc. Well, what do you think that gap is between? Why is there that gap between, on the one hand, what seems to be a fairly resilient anchoring of corporate responsibility to financial responsibility, even though increasingly it seems that the numbers of shareholders that think differently is growing and growing. Why is there still that disconnect? And do you think that there is the beginnings of a change in attitude where that larger understanding of what fiduciary responsibility means starts to be reflected in their corporate policies?
Look, there's a lot to unpack there in that question. So I would say, in relation to the disconnect between political action and the will of the people, the big one there is power. And in Australia, I mean, our economy is traditionally an extractive economy. Those who stand to benefit from delay are actually a small number of companies, but companies with massive wealth that they've accumulated over very successful businesses in the last 100 years, particularly in the last 50 years. So um, it's a small number of actors that have made very effective um, demands on the Australian political system over the last 2 to 3 decades. So we've had, prime minister after prime minister lose their jobs over, effective campaigns run by coal, oil, and gas interests in this company. So I would say the political class, in particular, the Australian Labor Party, is absolutely terrified of the fossil fuels industry. The fossil fuels industry um, has spent enormous amounts of time developing relationships and enormous amounts of resource in maintaining those relationships and making very, very effective and delivering on threats, political threats. So I think that explains the disconnect between the will of the people and the will of politicians in this country. But in terms of that other gap that you point to between kind of fiduciary responsibility and corporate responsibility, perhaps, and political responsibility. Look, I think that those who have a fiduciary duty, so in Australia, that is the superannuation sector in particular, so funds that represent the interests of long-term retirement savers, they do have a fiduciary responsibility to care about and manage systemic risk. And of course, climate risk is systemic risk, and it's the kind of risk that you can't manage through simple exposure. So you can't diversify away from the risk that climate change poses to our financial markets. And that is where our super funds are primarily invested. So there is this, I would say it's a gap of comprehension and also of incentives within the superannuation sector that has meant that they are not yet discharging their fiduciary responsibility, not just to worry about exposure to physical climate risk, but to actively mitigate physical climate risk. And that's the kind of crucible that they need to go through in one way or another, whether that's through regulatory intervention, legal intervention, or just an increase in comprehension in order to discharge that duty, which is very serious.
And of course, I guess one of the challenges, and also perhaps one of the fig leaves that might be used, is that a bit like in the 60s, the way that big tobacco was able to exploit the ambiguity around cause and effect, and just because there's kind of causal connections, we don't yet know for a fact XXX. It feels like there's a similar dithering around, because there's the capacity to fudge. Well, how do we exactly draw a line of connection between exactly how many tons of carbon versus what that storm did over in North Australia, etc. There's a lot of opportunity to exploit the ambiguities there as to what responsibility actually looks like.
Well, there certainly has been, and I think, but attribution science, so the science that actually does kind of pin changing climatic conditions and weather events on fossil fuels output emissions, that's vastly improved and continues to improve really rapidly. So I think that whatever ambiguity has been relied on either doesn't exist or won't, that will be harder to exploit. But of course, then what we're faced with is the lag between science and regulatory or legal action. So the enforcement of regulatory regimes, and that can be very large. And unfortunately for us, we just don't have that. Time is not on our side in terms of emissions reductions. They are urgent now, and we can't sort of sit around waiting for disclosure regimes or to take effect, or for legal judgments to be handed down. Government and corporations in whose interest it is to decarbonise need to be out there on the front foot taking action. And I should say, most corporations in Australia, the overwhelming majority of the corporate sector, stands to benefit from rapid transition over a medium-term time horizon. Like, yes, there's upfront investment, there's challenge, there's difficulty in the immediate term. There always is with change, but the studies, every study looking at the costs of inaction versus the costs of action show that the costs of action are absolutely dwarfed by the costs of inaction over a medium-term time horizon. So those who stand to benefit from further delay are those whose industries will die. Everyone else stands to benefit from action.
Absolutely, yeah, and we will be talking shortly to Ross Garno, and of course his Superpower Institute is all about talking about not just the relative mitigation of risk and cost, but actually the value and profit to be made from the appropriate wrestling with new energy generation, etc. So there is definitely that story that's not perhaps sufficiently told. To talk a little bit about what ACCR does, as I understand it, one of the significant things, one of the ways it applies pressure is through shareholder resolutions to kind of push companies on climate action. First of all, could you talk a little bit, just to unpack a little bit what that means? How do you do that? And how effective a tool? How does that work?
Yeah, so we use, I think, shareholder strategy, which is, and other types of strategy, but one of our tools is shareholder strategy. And shareholders in major listed corporations have a certain set of rights, and that set of rights is pretty consistent in major markets globally. So ACCR is active in Australia, Japan, the UK, Norway, and some other jurisdictions where our companies and supply chains, expand into. So the standard set of rights is the right to vote on matters presented to the AGM of the company every year and at other general meetings. Another is to file shareholder resolution. So that is, and the rules around this are a bit different in each jurisdiction, but a shareholder or a group of shareholders in most major markets have a right to table an item for discussion and vote on the AGM agenda every year. And so I guess that's what sort of we're famous for. It's our history, and we continue to do it where it's effective to do so. Then there's another right called the filing of a member's statement. So shareholders can file a statement to be put on to the materials of AGM. It might be in relation to the election of a director that's been nominated by the board, or to some other vote that the management is putting up for a vote of shareholders. So we've used that tool a bit in the past, particularly at Woodside. We filed some members' statements in relation to the re-election of directors. Then there are other rights in relation to the nomination of directors. And we've seen that used very effectively by Grok Ventures, Mike Cannon-Brooks's investment vehicle that was used to really transform the board of Australia's largest emitter, AGL, and we've seen various campaigns like that around the world. Then shareholders have a variety of other kind of rights if they have large shareholdings. ACCR doesn't have large shareholdings. We generally have small shareholdings, but sometimes we work with shareholders with large shareholdings in companies. And then there's a range of legal rights. So ACCR, as a shareholder in Santos Limited, is currently engaged in a very long-running federal court case against Santos in relation to misleading and deceptive conduct. So shareholders and other market participants have the right to information which is not misleading or deceptive, or companies have a legal responsibility to not make misleading or deceptive statements. And so we've used those rights. So shareholder strategy really encompasses all of those things. And so ACCR has participated in the full
Yeah,
spectrum of them.
it sounds like in some ways the part of the role is to strategically work out if to some extent there's a kind of pay to play scenario to this, so you have to be a shareholder to do these things.
Yeah.
I imagine there's a kind of some sort of triangulation between which companies might be most susceptible or kind of available to some change in its core in its culture versus how much will it cost to do that to be a shareholder and how effective that will be. There's almost like a kind of cost benefit analysis perhaps in your strategy. Yeah.
Yeah, well, it's I guess where we're at in our strategy evolution is knowing when the opportunity is right, and using the rights that we have as shareholders responsibly. Because I do think in the last few years, the environment in which we do our work has become a higher risk environment. Companies are more likely to uh, uh, run aggressive, defensive operation. So, for example, a shareholder that filed a shareholder resolution at Exxon a couple of years ago was sued by Exxon for the use of that tool. So that hasn't happened in Australia, and we don't. We certainly hope it won't happen, and we don't think it will happen, but it can be a pretty high risk environment. But I guess we know the companies and the supply chains that we're seeking to influence, and the jurisdictions that we're seeking to influence really, really well. We've got a fantastic team of analysts and lawyers and scientific experts, subject matter experts, who really work to understand where the opportunity exists, um, uh, to resource those opportunities really well, and to understand, the kind of power map, I guess, that sits around that opportunity, who we can work with, who we're likely to experience opposition from, and to understand really what winning looks like. So it is a pretty sophisticated operation now, and I think
Yeah.
that's what it takes to do this work responsibly and manage risk and to play to win. So we really are about real change in companies and supply chains, to reduce real world emissions. And we're increasingly looking at really how we can have the greatest systemic impact in the time available, because we also can see that as we started with, the physical situation is much worse than it was when we started experimenting with these kinds of tactics. So we, as an institution that has resources and takes up people's time, we have a responsibility to be really responsible with how we use those resources and the very limited time that we have to have impact.
I imagine just as let's say on the fossil fuel side, there's a certain amount of coordination, you could say formally or informally, between different entities. There's also, I suppose, on the kind of on the climate side, there are other organizations like the environmental defenders, etc., other kind of groups. Is there an opportunity to, let's say, be stronger together in that regards with other parties?
Uh, well, certainly yes. And I think when you name the coordination of the other side, really the fossil fuels industries, or those who stand to benefit from delay, they've been highly coordinated in a very sophisticated way, particularly through their industry associations, right? So rather than having companies making direct threats to government, they've had the Minerals Council of Australia and what used to be known as APPIA. There are those organisations that are still remarkably effective. But I think investors. So we collaborate with institutional investors within the limits imposed by law. So legal regimes do have something to say about coordination among shareholders in companies for good reason. And So I think there are investor industry bodies that that exist, who, well, have as part of their mandate the coordination of collaborative initiatives, but as to whether they've been effective, I think you'd have to say no. They haven't been nearly as effective as the fossil fuels industry. And I think one of the things that the side of transition has suffered from is this kind of politeness or laboring under the false assumption that everyone can win
Hmm.
and so we can't. There are some win-wins available to us, but really we have to accept that if we want a shot at preventing the most catastrophic outcomes, we need to phase fossil fuels out of our energy and industrial systems now. And the resources of the fossil fuels industries have been absolutely locked into preventing that. And the forces on the side of transition have not squarely looked at that adequately. Certainly, the corporate and investor forces. I think within the civil society movements, that obviously has been a conversation for a long time. But investors that want transition need now to accept that the time for fossil fuels phase out is now, and they need to squarely look that in the eye.
Yeah. You mentioned a phrase earlier about when you have wins, and it does make me wonder, because as there's a variety of ways you described that you can undertake different forms of activism and different types of corporate change. But just for our listeners, what kind of would represent kind of the most a moment where you might reach for a bottle of champagne? What represents a win for you? When does ACCR feel like celebrating?
Yeah, I think when we see companies making decisions that immediately or over the longer term result in real world emissions reductions, and where we've collaborated effectively with institutional investors to deliver them. So I'd say that I've got some examples of really clear wins. But we also think that uh, investors participating effectively in the public discussions that we have around what needs to change is also really, really motivating for us. So I'll give you some examples from either side of those. I actually have to go outside Australia to find them. So recently, so we've been engaging with Nippon Steel Corporation, the world's fourth largest steel maker, Japan's largest steel maker, for the last few years, and recently, after a number of years of engagement alongside major institutional investors, mostly institutional investors based in the UK and Europe. The company has made a decision to start investing in electric steelmaking technology rather than invest money in prolonging the life of metallurgical coal in some of their steelmaking plants. And that results in permanent demand destruction for fossil fuels. And we see that as really permanent wins. Um,
And that's a
uh,
consequence, Bryn, that's a consequence, partly obviously many things, but also you're saying that's a consequence of applied strategic pressure in relation to shareholders and that side of their
I
business.
would
Yeah.
say that is one of the clearest ones where I'm really confident in saying the work that we have done with institutional investors has had a material impact on the company position. Knowing where they were 3 years ago and where they are now, and how big that gap is, it's been one of the clearest examples. There's another example from Japan where we know directly from the company that the persistent pressure applied by a group of shareholders with consistent requests over time, and the escalation into using their rights as shareholders to put pressure on the company has led to the announcement of a schedule for closure of some coal-fired power plants, which is really motivating. Look, I think the work that Grok Ventures did with renewing the board of AGL has resulted in some real world emissions reductions, and I think has resulted in that company using its voice more clearly to call for decarbonisation in Australia, which really does have that macro policy impact, keeping the pressure on the Australian government and Australian governments, state governments, to do what they can to hold to the climate targets, as that's been really, really important. We've got some, and so then in the more kind of systemic space, we're working with some institutional investors in Europe in relation to oil and gas majors. So there's a Norwegian company called Equinor. We've got a collaboration with some Scandinavian investors that really has translated into a direct conversation between those investors and the Norwegian government about fossil fuels phase out and not pursuing unprofitable, expensive, emissions intensive projects. I've got a high level of, I guess, confidence that those conversations will be fruitful. Some really engaged investors talking about like countering the narrative of the oil and gas companies like Shell in particular, and also BP, where those companies are kind of talking their own books, seeking to lock in gas demand over the long term. Over the last 6 to 12 months, we've been working with a group of investors, and we've really seen them step up and start to question some of that misinformation coming out of the companies. We think that those are really positive developments, but ultimately, it's not enough. The ultimate win is emissions reductions, and we're really far away from a safe pathway at the moment. So we need to see more action, and we need to see governments taking their international responsibilities seriously as well. One of the other developments recently is this International Court of Justice advisory opinion on climate change, which says really clearly that governments have a hard legal obligation to under the Paris Agreement to do various things, and that includes getting a handle on the activities of corporations within their control. So governments like the Australian government and the Norwegian government doing that? Absolutely not. So that is, that's hard law, and I expect that governments are looking at that decision very hard, and hopefully they're looking at it from the perspective of how do we align with this rather than how do we avoid it. But I'm a little bit cynical about that.
It has to be said, it hasn't really been borne out on recent High Court situations here in Australia where cases have been taken and haven't been successful. So there's definitely a lag, you would say there. I was interested you talk about Nippon Steel and their move to electrify steel production, and thinking locally or in Australian context. There are some organizations that appear to be at least talking about quite ambitious targets in relation to decarbonisation, not least of which Fortescue. What's your take on what Andrew Forrest is doing and his I guess his position, because he talks a big game. There's a lot of quite ambitious communications coming out of Fortescue in relation to green hydrogen, and some things seem more plausible than others. The electrification of the train network that can, I mean, it's quite extraordinary. I think it's called the Infinity Train because, of course, the coal and what he's mining is at a higher level than the port, and he's using the gravity of bringing that stuff down to the port as to electrify the train coming back up again. So there are things that seem quite optimistic and quite possible, but it's always hard to tell or to separate what is genuine ambition and integrity in sustainability from unfortunately the all too familiar concern of greenwash. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think people have a lot. Andrew Forrest has a long record in business, and people. It is fair for observers to bring that history into their analysis the commitments and whether they're achievable. So I think some kind of caution around that is fair, but I do think the ambition is in the right place. It's certainly where it needs to be. That he's talking about real zero, not net zero. That he's speaking clearly about the problem, and I think what he does know is that Australian iron ore won't be competitive in a global green steel making industry unless some major changes happen. And so I think for Andrew Forrest, where financial interests align with his values, that's the sweet spot. So again, I think some caution is warranted and justified, but I think it is very welcome to have the leadership of a major company speaking clearly about the problem. I think on the solution side, it's more challenging, and certainly, he's investing a lot of his own capital in those solutions and being innovative, and that's welcome. But I think on the solution side, that that you still need to be a little bit cautious. But certainly, it is beyond time and very welcome to have the leadership of a major company speaking so clearly about the problem and so clearly about the tactics of the other side that stands to benefit from delay, and putting resource towards countering those tactics. So we need other companies saying that. We need our major financial institutions saying that. It's in their interest to do it. It's in the interest of their shareholders. It's in the interests of those that borrow money from them for their mortgages. It really is in the interest of the overwhelming majority of us. When I say us, I mean individuals and institutions, to push very hard right now for real decarbonisation, real world emissions reductions. And so to the extent that Andrew Forrest and Fortescue are talking that game, that is welcome.
I guess the one of the challenges, particularly when you look at a global context, is that obviously a lot of Australia's prosperity in recent decades has come from, as you say, extractive industries and putting things in ships and sending to other parts of the world. And one of the pushbacks from from those who are not as ambitious on climate, perhaps, is that, well, we can do stuff in Australia and we can talk to other, let's say, advanced technologies in Japan or in Norway. But in the meantime, you have these huge and very welcoming trade partners potentially in India and other countries that may not have the same pressures, let's say, social and political pressures regarding climate. What do you say to someone who'd say, well, we can get on our high horse and reform things in our relationship to countries like Japan and Norway, but what happens when African countries or other countries that are less interested come knocking and want to buy our steel? Because of course that's where the complicated scope 3 emissions, the stuff that Fortescue isn't directly responsible for, nor are any of the other miners. But as soon as it's shipped off overseas, how do we account for that in a world where there are other markets that that will happily take those carbon emitting materials? How do we deal with that challenge?
Well, I think it's a remarkable pivot from some in the fossil fuels industries to frame themselves not as profit-generating machines, but as poverty alleviating machines. I think it's disingenuous, and I guess every time that I hear it, I reject it. The main forum in which we hear that, we hear two things coming out of the oil and gas industry globally. One is poverty, and the other is security. And I think both of those arguments are used disingenuously. So, engaging with the Australian oil and gas industry and the European oil and gas industry, if you ask company leadership to justify claims around one of the things that they like to say is that Australian gas is displacing coal in Asia. Right. This is one of the claims that's repeated over and over again. But if you ask them to give examples of that, they really don't have any to show for themselves, or they can point to extremely minimal evidence of that, very speculative evidence of those kinds of claims. So that maybe it's another shade of it as well. So there's the security, the poverty, and then the gas is actually green arguments that we get. So I just think these are narrative arguments. We know that fossil fuels are very expensive. They're very expensive forms of energy now, right? The cheapest forms of energy are renewable energy, and developing economies need to be able to invest in those things. And what we know from the oil and gas industry is that they're still spending money on trying to convince developing market economies not to do that, but to lock in fossil fuel demand and drive their company returns. So
Totally.
it's I just don't put much into those arguments,
Sure.
but I think they are pretty powerful.
It was a devil's advocate question I felt I had to ask you there, Bryn. I completely agree with you on that. I mean, in some ways, the counter argument would be that, as with telecommunications, there are parts of the world that may well just leapfrog and just not have to be stuck with legacy technologies. And as soon as the infrastructure gets bigger, it gets bigger in a 21st century technology, not 20th century. So that's what we would hope for sure. One other, just to kind of like manage one more of the common, I guess, positions that one side of politics might kind of like put forward is I guess, the question of what's called just transitions. I mean, that's a term obviously that goes back to the 70s and 80s and relates to other industries as well, but it's particularly prescient here in situations where you have legacy industries, and in many cases they have supported lots of jobs and lots of prosperity in different regions, particularly outside of the city. And of course, someone like Barnaby Joyce is very effective at using the regional kind of card as a way of saying, "You city folk don't understand us." But nevertheless, though, I mean, is there a part of ACCR's? I mean, it's called corporate responsibility, which would include social responsibility as well. So I presume you have to kind of balance, let's say, the speed and efficiency of a transition in relation to carbon emissions and climate action. You'd have to have some balance against what the implications are for different communities, different job sectors, etc. Is that part of your calculations?
Yeah, look, certainly we're sensitive to it and attuned to those issues, but I'd say that if, to the extent that we hear this binary framing around transition and jobs, or like, yeah, the need to change our energy systems and the need for people to have jobs in the regions, it's a false binary. So I'm from the Illawarra, right? I'm from a coal mining region originally, and a bunch of the people that I went to school with work in emissions intensive jobs in the fossil fuel sector. It's there are it is not that people generally want to just keep doing fossil fuels jobs. It's that other jobs need to be available for people. So that is the responsibility of government. When an industry is in decline, and when we can look at an industry, and we've been looking at these industries for a really long time, and we've known that they need to decline, it is the role of government to use the power that they have and the resource that they have to come up with good plans. And so we're just overdue on those things. So I would say, the oil and gas industry, for one thing, vastly overstate how important they are to our economy and our regions and our jobs. They do that, but where there are, so if we accept the premise that fossil fuels industries or emissions intensive industries are important, then it's really important that government works with companies and industries to, do what is necessary to transition. So retraining, development of new industries in the regions, generous subsidies packages, we have, or transition packages. We have the resources available to do that in Australia, and the choices that we've made not to do that are political choices. So we need to make different choices. Government needs to make different choices.
You mentioned we talked quite a lot about the fossil fuel industries, and you mentioned as an example of I guess doing better, Mike Cannon-Brookes, Grok and Atlassian, etc. Who are the other players in an Australian context that maybe represent a positive future for climate? What other sectors, let's say, are taking their corporate responsibility in relation to climate seriously, and that you think represent the future for Australia?
Um, it's a good question. I think like we do have there is a lot of effort and a lot of resource going into taking advantage of the incredible renewable resources that we have in this country. I think one of the most exciting developments that I've heard of over the last few years is the First Nations Clean Energy Network, which is really bringing together First Nations communities around the country and renewables developers, and making sure that First Nations communities have agency and power in conversations, and that renewables developments are happening on Aboriginal land. So I think that's sort of really positive. I think there's a lot of entrepreneurial action in this country, and we're certainly seeing citizens take responsibility for their own emissions. But really, our massive industrial systems and the relationship between government and extractives, fossil fuels industries, needs to change. Like really, the bulk of Australia's emissions, so Australia's Scope 3 emissions, the emissions that we export to other countries, are absolutely much bigger, 4 or 5 times bigger than our domestic emissions, and they come from massive fossil fuels developments. So really, it is a handful of companies, and I would say enabled by not only government but other aspects of the private sector. So lending, for example, by banks to support new fossil fuels developments just shouldn't happen anymore, but yet it does. So there's an enabling economy which sits around those developments, but that is the core of the problem, and government has a responsibility there, as does the investment sector, who are, the Australian superannuation sector. If you look at it overall, it can be, if you look at if you think of superannuation as one or as a group, they'll often be the largest shareholder in these companies, right? And if they use their combined power, so if we step back to kind of again where we started, superannuation investors have a responsibility to care about the future retirement savings of their beneficiaries. And at the moment, if you're, say, you're a large shareholder in a fossil fuels company and you're signing off every year on fossil fuels expansion by that company, and you're failing to use your rights as a shareholder to push emissions down, to prevent new projects going ahead, and to penalise company directors who persist with activities that are inconsistent with global climate goals, then it's going to be pretty hard to justify how you're discharging your fiduciary duty to your beneficiaries who are going to retire in 50 years' time or 40 years' time. So the health of the entire system is at risk because of the actions that we're taking now. The superannuation sector in Australia is not doing enough, not nearly enough, to put pressure on those actions to decarbonise the companies in their portfolio. So it's really a big moment, and there's quite a lot of opportunity there. But if that power is not used responsibly, then there will be a reckoning. There will be a fiduciary problem for the superannuation sector at some point in the future.
Yep. We're almost out of time, and I don't want to run over for you, but I guess the last question is, you mentioned you're just back in Australia. possibly from other parts of the world that might be further along the conversation than we are here. You've mentioned the scorecard of 1 or 2%. There's two ways of looking at either that it's um, why the hell have you come back to Australia? Or isn't this an amazing place to make a difference? What is it that keeps you positive when I know various people in different areas of the climate kind of business, let's say, and there are many times that they just want to go and buy a bottle of vodka and disappear under a desk somewhere. So what is it that keeps you positive, Brynn? And what should our listeners find some solace in?
I don't know if you've come to the right place for positivity, but I would certainly say there's still a lot to say. There's still a lot to play for, and so I am, and ACCR is really focused on that. So it is still absolutely possible for us to prevent really the worst climate outcomes. I mean, that is increasingly challenged by our proximity to global climate tipping points, which is very scary indeed. But certainly, um, uh, action now is still possible, and we have a lot of choices to make. So we're pushing for companies and government in this country and in other parts of the world to make those choices to prevent misery. So we think that that yeah, there's still a lot to play for. There's still a lot to save, and certainly don't plan on giving up anytime soon. But uh, the I think um, the big thing that we're focused on is comprehension of just the scale of risk that we face, and finding pathways for once that comprehension is reached, but whether it's by an institutional investor, or an individual or a group of individuals, finding strategies that metabolize that comprehension, that work in community, in relationship, uh, to um, to fight like our lives and the lives of all living things on Earth depend on it, because they do, and so um, it's certainly very challenging, but there's still a lot to save.
Yep. And in the meantime, check where your superannuation payments and what your bank is doing, I suppose, is the two very obvious takeaways from that.
Yeah, get them to use their power, and get them to take their responsibility seriously.
Very good. Well, look, thank you so much for your time today. And
Pleasure.
I wish you good luck with future legal battles and shareholder change.
Thanks very much.
So a very interesting conversation with Brynn O'Brien. Um, straight off the bat, I asked her what the scorecard would be for corporates in relation to climate change. 1, she said, out of 10.
Yes.
Now, some might say, in the context of a series of conversations called Climate Positive, that's not very positive. But I guess I would draw a distinction between what might be climate positive and what might be optimism, because she's probably not very optimistic, and she can see the mountain that has to be climbed. But at the same time, what gives me hope in what she's doing is that, as she says, there's a lot still to play for. The difference between hitting 2 or hitting 2.5 or hitting 2.9 is radical. And so what the ACCR is trying to do is try to pull that down. And to me, that is a very positive thing to be doing. So I think when we talk about climate positive, what we mean is, what are you actually doing to have a material effect to make this a better situation for us? And a bunch of examples we won't go into, but as she talks about, a bunch of really good examples of real world changes that the ACCR are helping to bring about. Tremendous.
Normalizing those new dynamics, and interesting to hear emerging in that discussion, as it did with our discussion with Ross Garno, that the noisy losers have a disproportionate political strength. They're consolidated. It's whether it's the ownership or the wealth, however you look at it, a consolidated smaller group who are the incumbent industry and has the knowledge that they are on declining. in terms of oil and gas and fossil fuels, have disproportionate political power because they've got the resources and sophistication to direct that power to the point of shaping our political parties, toppling prime ministers. These are things that you can see over the last 50 years. Whereas the emerging economy, the emerging winners in that economy are distributed, are not yet known, may never be the single dominant powers. And so they don't have the same political strength. And we get this opportunity to vote sometimes for two things that are almost the same choice, it feels. And so they can leave you feeling quite disempowered. So it's good to understand that picture, but then to look at a different picture alongside that of superannuation funds. Australian superannuation is over $4 trillion. That's larger, 4 times larger than the largest sovereign fund in the world. It's the second largest superannuation holding on the planet. And that belongs to Australians. It doesn't belong to any one Australian. It doesn't belong to just a couple of Australians. It belongs to the Australian community. And so that becomes a very important lens to look at this issue through. And she raised some of the ways in which we can sort of exert that strength, in particular, resetting the focus that those who manage our funds have on their fiduciary duty and the returns and the way that they manage the risk to the funds and our well-being in the future. And drawing attention to investing in our future includes investing in climate adaptation, includes addressing the issues of climate change. That's not something you can diversify away, I think she's put it as. And so that was a very empowering realization, and one that I think starts to really give an interesting view into what we could change in some dynamics in Australia and potentially globally, in Australia's impact globally.
Totally. I mean, there's almost a kind of a deep irony in what you just unpacked there, because what we're saying and what she was saying is that in the political realm, it feels like you got a choice between bad and worse, and all these politicians are basically running scared from the fossil fuel lobby, and so therefore we have very little agency in a democracy to do much about that. And ironically, where we do have agency is in our pocketbooks and in our investments and in the superannuation funds, as you said, which are huge. And so actually, looking into where your superannuation money is going and what's being done with that money is incredibly important in the context of climate change. So, I mean, I think that's deeply ironic. One little mention about when she talks about this pivot within the fossil fuels to, move from profit machines to somehow social good machines, because we want to bring prosperity to developing nations. Just to add to that a little bit, because I did a little bit of look into, in particular in Africa, PV cells and solar have been growing dramatically across Africa. And that's not just because lots of people are green warriors. It's actually because what they want is reliable, sustainable energy supply, and they're fed up with the existing coal-powered networks failing all the time. We talk about intermittent power. Well, go to Africa and see how intermittent coal power is there. And you can't build an economy, you can't build manufacturing when you've got that terrible arrangement. So PV has been going up, up and up and up over the years in Africa. And so that tells a lie to that whole fossil fuel idea that all we're trying to do is help with the transition and bring prosperity. It's actually not that. They're trying to hold on to their profits by continuing to ship this stuff off. And they Scope 3 emissions from our exports, which is to say stuff that we don't burn ourselves domestically but is burnt overseas, LNG or gas or coal. It's a multiple of what everything that we consume in Australia. She said 4 or 5 times.
Yes.
I think that maybe a more conservative number would be 3 or 4. But anyway, a multiple of our carbon emissions is burnt overseas. And so that's what's at stake. And that's where the institutional money, in particular superannuation, really important, because if we just pull that out of there, we're making a massive a change, and we're not going to be depriving people of their energy resources. They're doing perfectly well transitioning to a clean energy,
and
with us.
We could even get behind that. Yeah.
We could even get behind that.
Yeah.
And so for the next episode, we're looking forward to talking to Catherine Quinn from Climate Works. Climate Works is an organization that comes out of Monash University partnered with the Meyer Foundation. And really what they do is bridge the gap between research and academia and policy and government decisions. So an exciting conversation with Catherine in the next episode. Please join us for that.
Yeah, see you next time.